All right, welcome. For those of you who are meeting us for the first time, BoardStrong is a 501c3 nonprofit. Our mission is to help boards strengthen their governance, and we believe that board members can learn a lot from other successful board leaders. And that's why we put the series together. It's the second of a series of panels. Our next panel will be March 24th, and we'll feature board members who are millennials, so look for that. Let's just get started. I'd like to introduce our moderator, David Rottkamp. He is an audit partner at GRASSI and leads their nonprofit practice. He's also a member of my board of directors, a former treasurer of the New York Council of Nonprofits. And welcome, David. Take it away.
All right. Thank you, Barbara. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on which time zone that you're in. I don't think anybody's in our good evening time zone, which would mean you're overseas in Europe somewhere. Hope everyone is doing well, staying safe and staying healthy. And thank you all for joining us today as we go through a panel discussion around the keys to being a successful treasurer. When Barbara announced the panel series for 2022 as a board member of BoardStrong, I gladly jumped in to lead this discussion, as I've served on four boards and have served the role of treasurer on several of them, as well as other officer roles as well. My day job is 3.5 decades working in the nonprofit space as an advisor and accountant to nonprofit organizations here in the Metro New York area, now more up and down the Eastern Seaboard. I'm thrilled to have wonderful panelists with us today to talk about what it means to being a successful treasurer, and in line with the role of BoardStrong as an organization that promotes great governance. Great governance starts at every position within the board, whether it's an officer level position at a board or just individual members or directors. Volunteers will do the best they very well can to lead and help govern the nonprofit organization to meet their fiduciary responsibilities. So with that, I'm going to ask my panelists to please come up on screen. And I'm going to do a very brief introduction and then ask each one of them to spend a little bit more of time themselves as well. And Susan, since you popped up first, we're going to get you first, and then Abiola will get you second, and Jay will pop up third when he can. So Susan Singer is a retired own accountant, over 30 years of experience in the accounting field, starting originally in public accounting and tax practice, then moving into forensics, and then moving into her own practice. And now she's in the second half of her professional career, the second stage of her professional career. Susan does a lot of volunteer work as well in her spare time and in her active time, and comes out of the Michigan area. Abiola Bankole-Hameed is a CPA and MBA at Kellen, where she's an executive vice president of shared services. I know she'll gladly tell us what that means. Looking forward to hearing about that. And she does a lot of strategic and results-driven work helping nonprofit organizations. Abiola has done some great volunteer work when she was in the Chicago area, and she'll tell us all about what that role was like and why that was so important to her. And last but certainly not least is Jay Kincaid. Thank you, Jay, for joining us as well. I see you up on my screen. I got a big screen here. I got to look all around to get everybody's faces. Jay's a partner at LVBW, LLP, Accountants and Consultants. So he's like me. He's an auditor, accountant, and tax person. And we have personalities that go along with our CPAs as well. He's been 32 years in public accounting, 21 most recently with his current firm, primarily working in the commercial sector, but also significant volunteer work and giving back to the community up in the Buffalo area and the western part of New York State. So Susan, maybe you spend a moment just talking about yourself a little bit and what you do and why volunteering is so important to you.
Well, thank you, David. You shared much of my background, so thank you for that. But I did retire about 10 years ago and found myself at a sisterhood function, and I made a wonderful mistake because I admitted that I knew QuickBooks, and pretty much that was all she wrote for me in terms of my volunteer work. I, after serving as my own sisterhood president, went on to serve as a district treasurer for many years, and now I have the honor of serving as the North American treasurer for WRJ, Women of Reformed Judaism. and it really gives me a place to use my skills, make great connections, and, you know, participate in causes that are very near and dear to my heart.
Thank you, Susan. Abiola, how about you?
Thank you, David. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. And thanks to BoardStrong as well for inviting me to be part of this panel. Abiola Bankole-Hameed, I'm in the Atlanta area. I work for Kellen, currently as the Executive Vice President of Shared Services. And in case you're wondering what shared services all entails, so I do, in what we do, we support a lot of 501c3 and 501c6 organizations where we really serve as the face of the association. We provide full management services for a lot of the associations under our portfolio. And in some cases, we just either provide one of our shared services. It could be IT support, marketing, accounting. So shared services, we do have a couple of functions, and we do have 2 EVPs of shared services. I have oversight for the finance and accounting function, obviously, as well as the meetings and events team as well, and the education team as well. So the other pieces of shared services will be IT, the creative department, the marketing department, business development, and advocacy. But I have those 3 sections. In terms of my volunteer role, I just, it was personal for me. I had both of my aunts passing away from breast cancer at the age of 46. And within a space of 7 years, too, I had 2 of my childhood friends also got diagnosed with breast cancer and subsequently passed. And when the second friend passed away, I was just like, okay, I can no longer sit on the sidelines. I need to get involved. And coincidentally, at the time, there was a board treasurer position opened at the Susan G. Komen Chicagoland area. And I just threw my hat in the race because at that point I was like, I have just got to do something. So that's how I got involved in that role while I was in the Chicagoland area. So that's a little bit about myself.
Wonderful. Thank you, Abiola. It's wonderful how, as volunteers, we generally dive right in 2 feet head first, and we're supporting what we believe what we are really passionate about. So, Jay, how about yourself, please?
Thanks, David. Yeah, so as David said, I'm the managing partner of LVBW LLP, a 35-person firm outside of Buffalo, New York. I'm also an audit partner, and I do have to correct one thing David said. I am not a tax guy. My answer to every tax question is deduct it, and that drives our tax people nuts. Strictly financials. I'm currently on the boards and treasurer of both Big Brothers Big Sisters of Erie and Niagara County, and on the Erie County Community College Foundation. I have 3 teenage boys. They have a lot of advantages in life, and I know that. So Big Brothers Big Sisters and Erie County Community College are both something that are important to me because they really serve populations that don't necessarily have all those advantages. So that means a lot to me. I will say, though, my most interesting board experience ever was on Susan G. Komen. I was board chair and treasurer when we went through a merger, 4 upstate affiliates into one, and that was a really wild experience. And I think given the landscape of not-for-profit today, merger and acquisition, is something that we're going to see much, much more of.
Well, thank you, Jay. Thank you, folks. First of all, thank you all for taking your time to be part of this and supporting BoardStrong and our initiative to really promote and lead great governance out in the nonprofit sector. So we all sit on boards. We all have been treasurers of boards, and as well as other officer roles as well, some local, some national, and it's what great work that we do. So. Jay, you described why you became current in yours, and Abiola, you did as well. So, Susan, what made you join the sisterhood? What drove you to want to be part of your volunteer work?
Well, initially, I had just retired, and after working full-time for 30 years in the accounting industry, what was I going to do with myself? And so I was originally looking to make friends and find a way that I could stay sharp and use my skills. I did not expect it to actually grow into what it has. But, you know, when you find a cause in a group of like-minded individuals, they sort of elevate you. And this organization is all about that, empowering women, providing all kinds of leadership development, personal, spiritual growth, and really knowing that combined, your organization, when you combine everybody, you can really make a difference. And it just keeps you coming back for more.
You know, finding something that you're passionate about is the most common theme we hear about with volunteers. They join boards. So not only do I serve on the board of BoardStrong, I'm also on the board of the New York Council of Nonprofits. So that's my affiliation with BoardStrong. But my mother lived with multiple sclerosis most of her life before she passed about 15 years ago. So I've been very involved. Like to Abiola's point, you know, you jump right in when it really hits home. And about 15 years ago, I joined our local Long Island board, which now is merged in with the New York City board. And I've been on the national board for close to 12 years now. And it's wonderful work and great work, sometimes tiring work. But you know, but when you have something you're passionate about, the tiring work makes you feel good when you're doing all of it. So thank you all for your volunteerism that you provide to all of your companies. So let's get started with what it means to be a successful treasurer. Abiola, why don't we start with you, and what are some of the thoughts you have around what drives success in the treasurer role?
Well, first and foremost, a successful treasurer, in my opinion, should have strong financial acumen. Should also be someone that has a strategic mindset, not someone that's just only laser focused on the financial aspect of the business. Because if you are laser focused on it, you miss the bigger picture of why the organization exists and the mission of the organization that you're involved with. So I think having a strategic mindset is key. Communication skills, it's very important for the board treasurer, one, to be able to communicate in very simple terms to other board members that don't really understand, you know, the financial jargon that we tend to have, but at the same time also have the ability to be able to translate board initiatives to the staff. If you're working with a group of staff on, you know, with a nonprofit, you will be having a two-way communication, you know, with the staff as well as with the board. So being able to translate what's going on to both parties, I think, is key. Critical thinking, not taking things at face value, and to be able to status quo, you know, challenge what you're seeing when you're looking at numbers. If something is not making sense, for you to be able to like delve into it and understand how things tie together. I think those are some of the things that I would say would make a successful board treasurer. One thing I'm missing is someone that is all proactive and also is that's also in tune with what's going on at the macro level, because you can't just be focusing on your little nonprofit without knowing, you know, what's going on at the macro level, how that would affect your nonprofit, and also being able to think long term, not just operationally within the next 1 year. It's like 5 years from now, how we make decisions now, how is it going to impact us down the line? So those are some of the things I would say would make up a successful treasurer.
Thank you. Yeah, the visionary aspect is a very important part of in any role on the board, and the board as a whole, having a strategy, thinking about vision, vitally important. Jay, how about yourself? What are some of your thoughts around success?
Dave, I completely agree with much of what Abiola said. I think the most important thing the treasurer does is be a communicator. You need to be able to communicate with the staff and the bookkeepers about the debits and credits and really get down into the weeds when issues pop up, you know, and then translate that at the board level to the financials to make sure they can understand what's in the financials, particularly in the footnotes. You know, there's a lot of information in there that tells a pretty important story. I think a lot of board members tend to focus on statement of position and, you know, the bottom line. And, you know, I think it's important that the board gets that. And honestly, many board members consider the accounting function, treasury function, you know, as the bean counters and, you know, not particularly important. So I think as treasurer, it's important for us to impress upon the rest of the board how important that function is, how important the financials are, that they be strong, that they be good, they be right, and then outside the board, we need to be able to communicate with outside parties, be they grantors or bankers or insurance companies. So I think the treasurer is really a pivotal role that, deals internally, externally with the board. And as Abiola said, translate the languages all those groups speak, into a language that they all understand.
That's great. Thanks, Jay. You mentioned the word, impress upon the board, and I, make that analogy into education. And I think that's an important piece of being a treasurer. But what are some of your thoughts around education, educating your board to understand the financial statements?
Yeah, it's so important because they're not on top of, they don't care what the latest FASB pronouncement is or anything like that, or, they didn't really understand what temporarily restricted is now versus donor, non-donor, that's a language they don't understand. So I think it's our job to boil that down for them so they get the real world implications of those types of, changes in pronouncements and why the opinion looks different this year. And, those various things that are on their radar day to day.
Agreed. Being able to convert what the numbers mean and what the numbers are to your fellow board members, they understand and trust what you're saying. What you're telling them as treasurer, I think, is another very important quality that makes a successful treasurer. Susan, how about yourself? Anything else you'd like to add to the conversation around success?
Well, I mean, right there, these two panelists have provided us a nice roadmap for success. But, for me in my role, I think being successful is also about training the others in the organization, like you said, education, who are responsible for reporting. We have so many volunteers with just a varying degree of skill. So things pop up and, you just need to be able to help them. I think communication, so important. I kind of see myself as a watchdog of sorts. And it's up to me to properly communicate in a very clear and transparent way exactly what that financial status is and what it means in the big picture.
It's always interesting how you will need to be able to make that into the bigger picture analysis, not just in the little microcosm of your operation or your business. So, Susan, you've been on the board of the WRJ for a while. You've been the treasurer for a little bit as well, and you've lived through the pandemic as the treasurer. So I'm sure your role has pivoted or changed in some capacity over the last now 24 months, let's say. So maybe you could talk a little about some of the best practices that you've been able to implement and how that change has been positive from your role to the overall organization.
It is interesting, the blessings that the pandemic sort of brought, in addition to, all the not so good stuff. But we really had to completely rethink our day-to-day operation. Instead of physically printing checks and sending invoices, we would do this in the mail normally. When our entire staff had to go remote and we had to change our whole setup, we established a really nice online system utilizing some really easy tools like Google Docs and things like that, so that I could go in, I could still verify all the payments, and in turn, everything is being handled now online through an online bill pay system. It's actually ended up saving the organization a great deal of money in terms of, needing to print and mail and all that kind of stuff. One of the expressions we use a lot in WRJ is flexible people don't get bent out of shape. And that is truly what this pandemic caused us to do. We had to be flexible in how we handled things. But we've got a very good system of checks and balances in place so that all the day-to-day operations handled, no problem.
I'm going to keep on popping off the mute, otherwise I'm going to just keep on talking to myself. If they get to 2 years, we know where that mute button is every single time, right? We still fall short. So Jay, you're going to be up next, so that way you can find your mute button while I tee you up on that. You were all ready to go. See, we're accountants with personalities. We try to have some fun when we do these panels, as well as share some vital information. So how about with your role, whether it's Big Brothers or even the foundation? Has your role changed as treasurer during the pandemic?
It has, David, in a couple of ways. I mean, the most obvious one was the relatively small not-for-profits. So PPP 1 and 2 were both in play, as well as the employee retention credit, and these were things that were a little sophisticated for the bookkeeping staff at both places. So I had to get pretty heavily involved in that. And those were lifesavers, particularly PPP. So spent a lot of time with that, was happy to do it because it was a real boon. The other thing that was new for me, there was a lot of desire with COVID to do things remotely or with limited participation. So then I kind of had to be the person who put the hand up and said, well, wait a minute, let's assess that. Does it make sense to do a golf outing with 50% of the people you had a year ago? Or will that event work remotely? Is there going to be a return on investment of it? Because people wanted to just jump into a lot of these, these COVID type situations where it's remote or limited. And, I think it required some careful thought to see what made sense. I would say those are the two biggest, in addition to what Susan said about figuring out a way that the office could be remote, and get the things done and the bank recs and deposits, which in the long run, just like Susan said, was a good thing. It increased a lot of efficiencies that otherwise might not have happened.
Great, thank you, Abiola. I'm going to go a little bit off script here for a second, but I think we're going down the word remote, and we didn't really talk about this as we were planning for our panel, but when we thought in the last 2 years, employees have gone remote, volunteers have gone remote, and I believe that there is now an opportunity from a volunteerism perspective to be able to find boards or work with organizations you might not have otherwise worked with because they weren't in your local geographic area. Okay. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, and maybe I'll ask Susan to say a couple words about that as well, because I know WRJ is in New York and you're in Michigan. So Abiola, maybe you can start that dialogue around remote volunteerism.
Yeah, the world is now a global village. So, some of the boundaries that we've put around us before is, you want to join this nonprofit, you have to be in that locality. I think all of that has gone away. Whether everyone has really opened their mind to that yet, I'm not 100% sure, but I think that opportunity is there, and it really would make a lot of nonprofits stronger because you can tap talent from anywhere. So that's just my mindset. I think there's a tremendous opportunity waiting, in this space for us to level up the skill set on a lot of the nonprofit boards out there.
Great point. Susan, how about you, from your perspective, being someone who has been a remote treasurer and a remote board member now for a number of years?
Well, honestly, WRJ was doing remote work for years. I actually remember about 8 years ago, being afraid. What is Zoom? How are we going to communicate? We used to do things by conference call. And I think about those meetings that we had, on a telephone, you couldn't see who was talking. But we've actually been doing this for a long time. Now, the technology has improved, and with so many of the volunteers now being exposed to Zoom, I think everybody is so much more comfortable with participating. So even though we've been doing it for years, the participation has gone up, unbelievably now. And we are reaching new people. Our first online leadership conference, we had over 1,400 people on that call from an in-person conference that we may have had 300 or 400.
That's impressive.
Right. That's the benefit of the smallness of the remote world and what nonprofits can actually do with their business and program operations because of the ability to attract. Well, so it's like fundraising, and we can go down a whole different path here. But even in fundraising, you'd have a gala with 200 people. Now you do an online fundraiser, you could have 2,000 people where you're raising money from 2,000 people instead of 200 people. So the world's become so much smaller. I guess that's one of the few benefits that has come out of the pandemic, was how we're able to operate now in this type of environment and how we can do it successfully. Here at BoardStrong, as the host of this panel, as we're placing board members, we're seeing the same thing happening, is that we're able to bring board members in, not just from New York, but also from around the country, but also help boards from across the country and organizations find board members. So it's much easier to put someone, say, in New York on a board in Washington, D.C., or someone in Florida and onto a board in California. You got some time zone stuff, but it's the placements and the identification now has become that much more open to everybody at all the organizations. All right, let's drop into our next question around financial statements. And I'm curious, because that's an important part of being a treasurer, is to be able to understand financials, question financials, present financials. So Abiola, maybe we can start with you and talk about, how often does the nonprofit that you work with, Komen, how often do they present financials to the board? Do you have a role in those financials prior to them being presented to the board? And do you actually present them to the board as a CFO to the board? Please talk a little bit about those three things. Then we'll go to Jay and Susan.
So the first question was about the frequency. I believe we had quarterly board meetings at the time, but monthly finance committee calls. And at the time it was just calls. So my level of involvement was, one, making sure I was in touch with the controller at the time to understand what was going on, to have the materials ahead of time, because I didn't want any surprises. I wanted to be able to understand what's going into the financials, be able to review it and, have my notes or, highlight what I wanted to emphasize to the rest of the finance committee as well as with the board. So I was involved. I was not every day, but there would be at least some sort of touch point at least every other week. In addition, I had approval responsibilities, for payables over a certain threshold. So anytime there was, something that came up, I would just jump in. It was actually, we did have an online portal back then. So we used the online, portal to approve. And then at board meetings, I would present the financial statements and, just highlight things that I thought were important that they needed to understand, and obviously field questions, because prior to going into the board meeting, I would have had, a detailed debrief with the controller on, the key things that I pulled out from the financials.
Great, thank you. Jay, how about yourself?
Oh, well, David, I'll talk about Big Brothers, Big Sisters, because that's a little more involved than the foundation. So we have bi-monthly board meetings, and the finance committee meets a week or two before those. And the finance committee, we don't have an actual CFO, it's more a controller level, just not that big. So we beat up the numbers pretty good, mostly like a flux analysis. We compare current results to the prior year and current results to budget, and I whack, we inquire and drill down on that where we need to. And then when we have the full board meeting, I'll present an overview, top line, bottom line, a few key ratios and metrics. In the case of Big Brothers, we'll, compare our revenue to lives touched, number of interactions between bigs and littles, as the organization says, those key metrics. And then if something is skewing pretty far off budget, we'll consider that if it's material, we'll consider the need of going to the full board about revising the budget.
Great, thank you very much. Susan, how about yourself?
So our organization has 2 general board of directors meetings a year. One of them, I will present an annual report. The other will generally be the budget chair, reporting on the budget numbers. But I don't have physical access to the accounting system. So I rely on the executive director of our organization to supply me with that information. And she'll provide me very detailed notes along with all the supporting documents for me to create what I believe are the key points to bring to the board's attention. I will also report separately to the executive committee. And throughout the year, the executive director will provide me financial sort of status updates that I will bring to the executive committee probably 4 or 5 times a year, or as needed. But basically it's the one time a year. And again, we're not necessarily giving the entire, financials, just highlighting those important key points.
I think that's important. And it sounds like there's some different ways that all three of you will, you function in your organizations. And a lot of it is having strong interaction with the employee base and your accounting. We're going to get into that in the question a little bit later on, I think. But Jay mentioned something about other metrics as well. And I'm curious to know, Abiola, when you were doing your treasurer role at Komen, did you have other metrics that you would provide into with financial statements? Was there any other data points or any dashboarding or anything like that you guys utilize, or any of you that may have utilized outside of just doing the basic internal financial statement?
Yeah, one of the key things that we typically tracked was fundraising efforts, sponsorships. So we did monitor that, as well as registration for events, and looking at the trends for those registration to see how to scale up or scale down based on what we're seeing.
Okay.
So those are some of the things we looked at.
Okay. Susan, did you have any as well in terms of the metrics when you were presenting a few times a year?
Absolutely. Depending on what's going on at that time, we may be drilling down for specific programs, looking at our philanthropy efforts versus our social action efforts. And then, of course, we're always keeping a close eye on our funds that drive a lot of our ability to do the work.
I, as treasurer for some of the nonprofits that I've sat on, so like when I was treasurer of the New York Council of Nonprofits, I had interaction with our CFO on a regular basis as we had our monthly audit finance committee meetings. But I would typically defer to our CFO to present the financials. They were organizational financial statements, and I was able at a higher level to present some analysis of the financial statements, some of the metrics that drove it, and the relationships of what the numbers meant maybe to the overall business operations of the organization. I felt that I had a skill set that would be more useful in that regard than just presenting the financial. So I think there's all different kinds of ways, and there's no right way or wrong way of doing financial statement presentations. It all depends on the skill sets of the organization, the message that you're trying to get out. So someone actually is asking, and thanks folks for some of the questions that are coming in. I know our panelists will be glad to respond by typing a response in, and for those that don't do that, we'll ask the questions. One is whether a CPA should be a prerequisite for being a treasurer position. Jay, what do you think about that?
I am a CPA, so I'll say that for starters. I think it is, and I'll tell you why. When I came on board of the foundation, the previous treasurer was not a CPA, didn't have a strong financial background, and there was next to no internal control. Now, it'd be difficult to have internal control in the best of circumstances. There's just not enough personnel there to have a good segregation of duties. But it was like the Wild West. People weren't approving bank recs. Nobody was looking at expense reports. And I just feel that somebody with that CPA background or coming from a strong internal control environment, maybe it doesn't have to be a CPA, is so important, especially at smaller not-for-profits where they're not as big, not sophisticated. You can't have a proper segregation of duties. You need some controls in place. And I think that's something board members need to be aware of, because they have a fiduciary duty over the assets of the organization. And the board needs to be confident that there are some controls in place and, things are getting looked at on a regular basis. So I'm pro CPA for treasurer.
I actually am pro CPA myself, but I still think you can be successful not being a CPA and still be a very successful treasurer. The CPA, the skill set derived from becoming a CPA, I think, is always beneficial to a nonprofit organization, and those lessons that you've learned from obtaining that license and working in the profession is there, but it doesn't mean you have to be. Susan, what are your thoughts about that around the CPA world?
Well, I mean, in a perfect world, wouldn't that be nice? However, for us, especially when you drill down to the local level, I mean, you getting volunteers to take on the treasurer role is very difficult. It just, people are afraid. However, I have successfully trained a kindergarten school teacher. She was one of our best treasurers ever. People who had no financial background, with the proper training, with a good system in place, can learn. And maybe when you get up to that North American level or a larger organization, absolutely, that accounting background is going to be crucial. But for volunteer organizations on that lower level, sometimes we have to be a little more accepting of who's willing.
Who's available, who wants to participate, who wants to do it? Do you have the person on your board, et cetera? There's lots of variables to go into that. It's a great question. So keep those questions coming. And Susan, while you're still on mic, why don't we get into the next question is around the relationship that you as a treasurer have with the CFO/controller or CEO/ED, and what does that look like? What's the frequency? And one of our attendees actually just asked that question as well, in terms of what's a healthy relationship, so versus an unhealthy relationship.
This is a really good question. So as I mentioned, I don't have access to the actual accounting system. So I work very closely with our executive director. Now, you know, numbers are a funny thing. Somebody can look at those numbers and see one thing, and another person can see another, and how we explain it, you know. So for me, I will take what the executive director says and then digest that and put it into how I see those numbers. That can be challenging at times. I will say that we just finished our budgeting process for this coming year. And, you know, I'm glad that meeting wasn't recorded, because, you know, we were not seeing things eye to eye. But I did feel it was my, you know, responsibility to speak up when I saw something that maybe I saw a different way and felt it was could be detrimental to the organization. And as long as it's done respectfully and with kindness, she accepted it very well. But yes, it can be challenging.
Excellent. Abiola, how about you? What do you think is the right frequency and the healthiness of a relationship?
I don't think there's a defined frequency in terms of, you know, touch points with a CFO or the controller. You have to understand, you know, the workflow, what's going on, key dates in terms of, you know, board meetings when you have to present financials or you have to be in front of other people, and walk backwards that way. What I don't think is healthy is when a board treasurer, it becomes a micromanager and is getting into the weeds and not allowing the CFO or the controller to do their work. That is not healthy for anybody and just puts undue pressure on the staff that are, you know, involved in the day-to-day activities.
I would completely agree. Micromanaging is not what the role of fiduciary governing role is. It's more of a macro level oversight and guidance versus you know, day-to-day operations. And
Exactly.
Jay, what's some of your experiences as both a CPA who presents the boards, but also as a treasurer as well on this topic?
Yeah, it's an interesting topic. I agree with Abiola. Micromanaging, I don't have the time for it, or the inclination. Nobody wants that. And I think, so for me, it's kind of an as needed basis. You know, if the CEO is going to go out to a new grantor and wants me to come along to explain the footnotes or something in the financial statements, I'm happy to do it, or meet with the bank. Again, happy to do it. Other than that, you know, I'm available as needed. I'm not the controller. I don't want to be the controller. In the case of the foundation, where it was a little bit of the Wild West before I got there, you know, we had to put some structure in place, and the CEO bristled at that at first. You know, but I was like, someone's got to look at the bank recs and the payees to make sure everything's legit. And I just explained, we don't want to wind up in the newspaper paper, is one of the organizations where the bookkeeper stole hundreds of thousands of dollars to support a gambling debt or, habit or whatever, and it was a one-time thing. We put processes in place. CEO understood, and it was good from then on. But that can be a tough discussion to have initially.
Great. So Jay, while you're still on mic, let me ask you one of the questions that came in from the Q&A. And what if the organization staff is not providing accurate financial information to the treasurer? And as treasurers rely heavily on staff to provide the accurate reports, what can we do as treasurers if that's not happening? Any recommendations for that one?
Well, I think then it's time for a heart-to-heart with the staff and the CEO to make sure, can we get to a place where they are providing accurate information? And if not, a change needs to be made, be that bringing in new people, outsourcing the accounting or something. But, getting inaccurate information is just not acceptable, to a treasurer. It can't be.
I would agree. I think going to the CEO, executive director level would be the right way to go versus making it a full-blown issue at the board level. You try that approach first, but I do think that the accuracy is what's vital to the success and running of an organization. You have to have that in place. The other option might be to contact the outside CPA who's there as well, who might have some insight on how maybe there's a different way of communication or recommendations for the treasurer to utilize to try to get more accurate information out of the finance person in the organization who's doing the work.
Make the auditor the bad guy. Totally.
That's what we do. We're the bearer of bad news at times, and that's okay. We drive, but it helps drive change in the organization. Right. That's something that I've readily accepted for many years now. Let's move over to strategy. And I know, Abiola, we focused on this in some of our discussions before we got started. Was, from a strategic perspective, being a treasurer, what have you been able to do, and what could others think about doing from not just numbers, but from a strategic perspective to help the organization move its mission forward? And then Susan, I'll ask you to respond, and Jay after that.
So as a finance person, our roles, or as treasurers, our role these days are expanding. The board is looking up to us, to also help shape strategy. And a successful treasurer really should be living up to that expectation. So when you have, sessions to discuss, the long-term strategy of, the nonprofit, the treasurer really should be playing a very strong role there, plugging in to make sure that you understand, where the nonprofit is headed and how everything ties together. Because as you're talking strategy, you also need to have at the back of your mind, how are we going to align the strategic goals to our financial goals? And that's why, a treasurer really does have a seat at the table when it comes to setting strategy. So that's kind of how I make the connection of, yes, I'm a treasurer, but I also need to be part of this conversation so I can help redirect or, rein people in when they're just like going in different directions that that financially you probably cannot accommodate what is being discussed.
Great, thank you. Susan, how about yourself?
I agree. It's so important to make sure that the financials align with the mission and the strategy. And I think in our organization, I would say a lot of that happens within the budget process. Where are we allocating those resources? Are they going to, is that going to enable us to achieve our goals? And if not, we need to rethink either the strategy or how we're going to fund that.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Jay, yourself?
David, I really don't have much to add. I agree with my two co-panelists completely.
Right, the treasurer role is vitally important when you're doing strategic planning. And that is, many nonprofits undergo a strategic assessment, a strategic plan. Used to be a 5-year strategic plan, many of them used to be, and now they've shortened them down to just a couple of years now, strategic plans. And I believe the treasurer role has a real vital part of that process. While the board as a whole is creating the visionary strategy, it's really the treasurer who has to make sure that there's resources to be able to execute that strategic direction. And if a treasurer is going to sit back and just be quiet during that conversation, that nonprofit may go down a path it's not going to be able to recover from if those resources aren't there, especially from an investment perspective. And we've also seen in the coming out of the pandemic, such significant reductions of nonprofit staff and costs in order to sustain themselves. Now they're starting to reverse themselves operationally. Many haven't had the foresight really to bring people back and create the infrastructure again. I think that's also an important part of the treasurer responsibility, is to try to help the organization identify those pivotal points in time during situations like what we're dealing with now, when to bring folks back in so they're able then to ramp up to provide the really needed services in the community and the neighborhood. So any thoughts around that, folks? I know kind of a little off script here, but any thoughts or comments around that? Anybody want to jump in? Okay. Well, we're getting a few questions around smaller organizations. So why don't we go there for a little bit, and then we have about 10 minutes or so to go. But we seem to have a number of smaller organizations that are on our call today that don't have CFOs or really controls. They work with primarily a smaller finance team, maybe an outside CPA, or maybe a bookkeeper, something like that. Does the treasurer's responsibility change because there isn't that controller or CFO level person within the organization? Jay, any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I'm afraid it probably does. I've been involved in a couple of situations where, somebody left, retired, quit, and we didn't, replacements weren't in on time or didn't have the right skill set. And I had to get a little more involved in the day-to-day than I ever really planned. But I think that does fall to the treasurer, because that's who the board's going to ask, if something's not getting reported or done, it's going to fall to the treasurer. So sometimes we do have to step in and take over some of the day-to-day. But when that happens, my number one goal is to get the resources in place so that I don't have to do that for very long.
Right. There are times I think the treasurer will sometimes step into an internal control role in a smaller organization. Abiola, maybe you want to talk a moment about that, or if you've seen that happen, and maybe we can chat about how a treasurer might step into the internal control process.
Yes, I have seen that. So in a smaller organization, the role of the treasurer is probably stepped up more, where you're focused into the day-to-day. And where you have the internal controls play out is when it comes to approvals and segregation of duties, sending out payments, especially if it's electronic payments, and maybe you have someone on the team, that can, put in this information into the system. The treasurer might be that layer, that goes into the banking system and then approves, so that, everything is not just happening without any type of control. So those are kind of like the controls that you want to put in place at smaller type organizations, making sure that things like maybe you're not accepting cash for events, you're just moving things more electronically, but also making sure that there are notifications going out. There's simple things that you can do. So if someone, has like a swipe or, a debit card and they can make purchases, as soon as that happens, the receipt goes to maybe the board treasurer or somebody else. So you at least have your eyes on what is going on.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. I've seen many small nonprofits rely on their treasurers to help. I've also made many recommendations, I'm sure Jay has as well, in our public practice, to increase the role of the treasurer, to help with the segregation of duties and checks and balances, only because you don't have the people power within the organization itself. And that happens a lot on volunteer, board-driven nonprofits that don't have staff. Whether you just have programmatic staff, don't have administrative or operational staff. So the board's role becomes even that much more important. Susan, what do you think about the idea of sharing officer roles if you have a small nonprofit? So you have a treasurer, but maybe that treasurer might want to be the vice chair or secretary or a chair. Do you see any issue or concern with that?
Well, I guess it depends on what responsibilities the treasurer is going to have, within that, and whether or not they have the bandwidth to cover it. We do run into it quite often with our sisterhoods in our district that have no staff. All of those organizations completely lay-led. And I find that the treasurer actually takes on a much bigger role. They become the bookkeeper or accountant as well as kind of the overseer. So, I mean, what I see in those situations is the rest of the board sort of having to become more involved, making sure that those good checks and balances are in place.
Right.
So I would never want to see a treasurer also acting perhaps as president, where those two roles should be very separate. Perhaps the president is the one who should be approving, the payments or reviewing bank statements, bank reconciliations. So there would be a conflict of interest in combining certain roles with that treasurer role if they have responsibility for the whole financial, kit and caboodle.
Great responses. And I think it also varies potentially based on the state you're located in, because each state has nonprofit law, which dictates the roles of boards within a nonprofit organization. You have to be mindful of what that is as well. There's no strict prohibition in New York that I know of that says you can't have that. And I have seen actually the role of president or chair and treasurer be combined, interesting, on like a brand new organization where they just have 3 or 4 new board members to get started with, and they have to share some of the responsibility, at least to get the nonprofit off the ground. In one of those examples, it was a friend of the firm's who started a new nonprofit, and the founder became the board chair and the treasurer because of his financial acumen. But within 24 months, they found the treasurer, they found the secretary, and they then expanded the board to diversify the responsibilities. So not optimum, that's for sure. Jay, any thoughts from your perspective on this
No,
topic?
I agree. I mean, I have seen treasurer and secretary often combined, much less so president and treasurer. But it does make sense for a newish not-for-profit. But ideally, I'd rather see treasurer and secretary maybe combined and president and vice president separate.
Okay. Abiola, another question we have that came in asks about what would a typical monthly financial report look like? What should it include? What should the treasurer be asking for from its finance team to allow the treasurer to present information to the board?
I would say, the statement of financial position, the statement of activities, cash flow. If it is a nonprofit that has a lot of receivables, you also want to make sure that you're looking at the aging receivables to see the quality of the receivables out there. You having, lots of your receivables that are over 180 days, over 90 days, you need to have an action plan because that ultimately would affect your cash flow. So at the very minimum, I would say those 4 reports should be looked at monthly.
All right, great. Thank you for that. Susan, I want to pose this question to you. I know we spoke about this a little earlier. Was with your role in your organization, volunteer, you have to interact with others. I'll call it outside of, it's within the organization, of course, but really outside of what you would say is your typical just board responsibilities as treasurer. Maybe you can take a moment and chat about what that might look like, and if our other panelists have any other ideas or examples around that outside connectivity, you can respond afterwards.
It's actually my favorite part of the job as a WRJ treasurer. So our organization is structured with local sisterhoods over the whole country. Those sisterhoods then roll up to geographic regions. We call them districts. Again, all of these, no staff, lay-led. So the districts have to report up to WRJ so that we can complete an audit. Now you have different ways of doing things. We have 8 districts. They all have little nuances and their little quirks for each district. They like to think of themselves as independent little organizations, but really we're all one. So my job is to go in and work really closely with those 8 treasurers, especially and try to create some sort of standardized reporting. Make sure everybody is on the same page with what our overall mission is. Each area might want to do it a little differently, but when we bring it all up to New York, we want to all, be going for the same mission, moving the organization forward. So I spend a lot of time doing that. It's through webinars, through workshops. Anytime there's our wonderful auditors present a change in how we're going to be doing things, it's up to me to make sure that that rolls down to all those districts. So that's probably what I spend most of my time doing. I also act as a liaison from the districts to the audit chair and staff. So again, just making sure everybody's on the same page, thinking the same way, even if they're doing it a little differently.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much for that. It's certainly helpful to others who work in organizations that have maybe other districts, chapters, areas as part of their business. Folks, we're coming down to a close. So if you still have any questions that are in here that we haven't been able to answer, I know Barbara will pull them together and we'll directly respond to those questions that come in, but thank you for bringing them. There is one question around board terms. Board terms, if you have them, are outlined in your governance documents. If they're not outlined in governing documents, you should think about having some. I think having freshness of people within board roles as well as board officer roles is important. My recommendation would probably be somewhere around 2 to 3 years sitting in an officer role, although most boards vote on officers on an annual basis. But typically maybe with maybe an annual basis, but maybe a 3-year limitation in terms of officer role. That way it gives others a chance to bring perspectives to the table. So something to think about with that one. And I know we have just about 2 minutes left. So we're actually, we never get through everything. You just can't do it in these discussions, but this has been such a wonderful hour to spend with everyone. It's time for final takeaways, everyone. And I'm going to look to my right and I see Jay first. So Jay, what's the final takeaway you have as part of this session today?
Well, David, thank you for having me. This has been great. I really enjoyed listening to all three of you. I think the takeaway for a treasurer is you need to be a communicator. You're not just a numbers person. You need to communicate and think about the audience you're communicating to and speak in their language.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Jay, for that. Susan, how about yourself?
I agree. Being a communicator, making sure that your board is not only aware of what's going on financially, but understands it in terms that they can relate to and how it affects the overall mission. Very important to being a successful treasurer. And thank you, David. And I really do appreciate BoardStrong for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you. And Abiola, how about you with your final takeaway?
So I agree with both panelists about the communication, being a great communicator. In addition to that, I would also like to add that, the treasurer should be someone that has integrity. Because without integrity, you don't have anything. And when you have integrity, that also brings credibility to the information that you are presenting and providing. So
I think that's wonderful. Those are all great takeaways and wonderful points for our discussion today. I've been thrilled to be part of this group and talk about the roles of treasurers, and to all of our friends out in video land. You're all friends of BoardStrong or should become friends of BoardStrong. We want you to be knowledgeable about who we are and what we do as an organization, how we promote great governance in the nonprofit sector. But we're also a resource to help organizations become better. So we have lots of resource guides as well as placement opportunities for organizations as well as for individuals who want to be placed onto boards. So please visit the website. I mean, I'm probably taking some of Barbara's thunder here, but Barbara, once I get a microphone, I don't give it up that easily. So it's a wonderful board to be part of. And I love the work that we do at BoardStrong along with the New York Council of Nonprofits to really promote the nonprofit sector in the state of New York and all the great things that we do together. So Barbara, with that, I'm going to pass it back to you for one last comment. And I want to again thank my panelists for participating today.
Thanks to everybody who joined us today. Thanks to the 4 of you. This has been a really great panel. I cannot end it without putting in a plug for our board matching program, which is boardstrong.org. If you are looking for a treasurer or any other kind of board member, please visit our site and find your next board member there. And I hope you will join us for our next panel a month from now, which will be on millennials on boards. And with that, I hope everybody has a great day and stay warm. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all. So nice to be with you. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.